Um, Quick, those of you who've been here before know that I like to hit some of our major conceptual ideas as we go forward with this. First is that history is not something that repeats itself in the sense that every moment is unique. It's not a replay of the past, so you don't get a practice run. What you do always matters and always has consequences. And the process of studying history is the process of trying to understand the stuff that happened. It's a lot more than simply listing the names and dates, but trying to figure out why people did what they did. But more importantly for us, it's about tying the dots together to our present lives. Exactly where did we come from, and what are our priorities, what are our values? Because history is like a vast test case. It's a vast study place where we can see how the human spirit unfolds itself again and again and again. And so while history doesn't repeat itself, the human nature, the nature of us as people, our interests, our passions, our fears unfold again and again. Agency is a term that we use in the study of history to make sure that we are clear that history is moved by people. In some ways, history is simply the sum of biography of the choices that we made, business decisions, financial decisions, romantic decisions. And so the core of the study of history is actually the core of the study of the individual. They're the same thing. And another major concept we use is about multi-causality, which means that humans are complex. Every one of us has multiple goals, and sometimes the goals I have to do one thing conflict with other goals I may have, and the goals of other people conflict with each other, and so there's a lot of sources. It comes from different places. So we really do our best to avoid kind of a statement that says this is why it happened. We could come up with a statement that say this is one of the reasons it happened, but we really try to get multi-causal. And then finally, I want to kind of emphasize the scope of our inquiry. And you can see this really well by looking what we've done this far in this series. So far in this series already, we've talked about roadways and women and established firms. We discussed all these things that are shaped where the world that we live in is a consequence of the automobile. And these relationships go back and forth. So if you look at the roadways in the upper left-hand corner, that the presence of roadways shaped the course of development of the automobile. But then the development of the automobile in turn shaped the roadways. The roles of women in society shaped the development of the automobile, and then the automobile shaped the roles of women. So these are non-recursive relationships. And so today we're going to move forward with another topic, and that appears to be on my screen underneath the camera pictures, but it's war. The topic today is war, and we're going to take a close look at the case of the Great War. And so there's a couple things to observe about this topic before we as we get into it. And first is that the world was in dramatic transition as we're rolling into the beginning of the 20th century. That people's understanding of war was changing, and it was diverging and going in a lot of different directions. In the United States, for example, the shadow of the Civil War loomed very large, and it was massive and brutal, and it caused cities to be burned, and countrysides were barren, and people were slaughtered in droves, and it was very brutal, horrible. And in fact, some of you may be familiar with what happened at the Andersonville prison complex, where tens of thousands of soldiers languished with cholera and dysentery and typhoid. And it actually caused an international reaction. The formation of the International Red Cross was one of the movements resulted from that. And so there was one lesson coming from the world, that war had a new type of brutality that had not been experienced before, and another level of totality, that it was all encompassing in ways it hadn't. But at the same time, there were other lessons of war that were happening. And one of the lessons was a deeper one in the American tradition, that you just stay out of Europe, you keep out of that stuff. And it was ever since the American Revolution, it was a Central American doctrine. The United States has had its wars. There was a Mexican-American War. There was the Spanish-American War around 1900, where the United States really emerges first as a global superpower around 1900, 1898. But this was the second lesson about American power separate from Europe. But the third lesson of war was the one that would be the dangerous one. The third lesson was the result of a series of wars in Europe. the Prussia versus Denmark in 1964. This sounds like soccer matches, but they were war, trust me. Prussia versus Austria in 1866, Prussia versus France in 1870. And these heralded the beginning of the new era of industrialized and technological war because they were very swift, they were relatively bloodless, and Prussia was triumphant over this because of railroads, telegraphs, and breech-loading rifles. So the new message was transportation and technology is the key to having fast, relatively bloodless, amoral war, where moral values didn't really matter at all. Now, in the wake of these kind of transitions and changes about the view of warfare, the automobile was entering the stage of human history. And beginning early on, military thinkers started to see the utility or the possible utility of the automobile. And so we could see this in policies in different countries around the world. For example, in 1908, France, England, and Germany all began ownership programs in their countries whereby they would subsidize the owners of automobiles with the caveat that if war came, those automobiles would be made available to the military for their use. And so it was a way of both promoting industrial production and craftsmanship, a way of promoting ownership of the automobile, but also at the same time securing the military needs, because they believed that the future of the war would have automobiles involved in some ways. Similarly, in the same period, 1909 was when government contracts in Italy began for the purchase of Fiat trucks. And then in 1910 was when France began purchasing trucks for its military. American thinkers were watching what was happening in Europe, and they went through the same kind of debates. And the United States eventually decided not to invest in vehicles for production, because they decided first that it was unlikely there was going to be war on American soil since we're separate from the Europeans. And this is a map that you don't have to see too detailed, except to know that each one of these squares on this map, each one of those squares is 10 miles across. This is northern France. This is a 1914 map of northern France. And what you see on that is an absolute spaghetti lattice work of closely knit roads crisscrossing the countryside, something that did not exist in the United States in any way, shape, or form. And so because of the extensive roadway system in Europe, largely due to cyclists and agricultural development, the automobile would have a very different role in European wars than it would have in American thinking about strategic power. So the automobile early on appeared to be something very significant for warfare. And so as we turn to our study today, I want to point out three different ways of thinking about this. We're going to think about the role of vehicles in the First World War. We're going to think about the role of the automobile industry in the First World War, and we're going to think about the consequences of these vehicles and industry and the war for how the automobile and society would be shaped after the war. So the automobiles were looking like they were going to be significant. Nobody really knew for sure, but people knew that industry was significant. Throughout the last 200, 300 years prior to the First World War, small arms productions had been a large industry in the Civil War, to the lesser extent in the Napoleonic Wars, but arms production had never been really the definitive feature that won wars. It had always been boots on the ground. It had always been the individual soldiers and the ability to put masses of them out there. But now with the advent of large battleships and the advent of the possibilities of aircraft, all of a sudden production capacity meant a lot more. So it meant that when the United States was going to war, it would turn to the industrial institutions of the country, and that meant Ford. Now, it happens that both Ford and Willie Durant was the chairman of General Motors at the time. Both Henry Ford and Willie Durant were adamant pacifists. And this is a position that was more common in the United States than it is now, because you have to remember the United States was just a second generation out of the Civil War. In 1864, the Civil War had come to a close. And so there was still a long legacy of that. In fact, the largest budgetary item in the United States government at that time was the Veterans Department, paying for the veterans' injuries and illnesses of veterans from the Civil War. And so there was a keen awareness of the brutality. And so there were a lot of people who were very strongly anti-war, and it meshed very well with the sentiment of staying out of Europe. So Henry Ford came out very early as a pacifist, and that he rejected and opposed the United States going to war. And in fact, he did something really fascinating in 1915. He put together a large delegate of pacifists. He put together a delegation of pacifists and sent them to Europe. And this is a cartoon that would make fun of that. But he gathered intellectuals and pacifists. He rendered a steamship called the Oscar. And you can see from this cartoon commentary in the background, you have a sinking American ship, and you have a U-boat, and then a German, obviously, welcome to Europe. Thanks for coming and helping us out, unpatriotic. But this really made huge fun of Henry Ford, because you can see it looks like a sales ad at some parts. You can see underneath the smokestack a price list. You can see a dove with an olive branch towed behind, and then an Edison gramophone, all these kind of elements that we're mocking and make fun of Henry Ford. But it's really fascinating that how strongly he opposed going to war. And so he actually traveled on this ship across the Atlantic with the group. And the archives have preserved a transcript of actually the original of one of the telegrams he sent from the SS Oscar. And it's a fascinating read. You should Google the SS Oscar in the letter somewhere. But essentially, he's reaffirming the goal. They're going to call a general conference in Sweden. They're going to ask for leaders from around the world to come, and countries to get together and bring the madness to a close, because there's no reasons why we can't get along. And for people to study the history of diplomacy and the history of the war, there's something most people don't realize, is that there was never a war that ended on a battlefield. Every war always ended at a table. They ended when somebody and people got so sick of fighting that they sat down with a pen and were willing to work it out. And sometimes it happened earlier and it happened later. And he said, why wait till we kill 10 million or 20 million people, which is what eventually happened. Let's sit down at a table now and bring this to a close. And of course, he was not successful. And so he opposed going to war. He tried to stop any kind of war production at the Ford Motor Company, as did Durant. However, as soon as the United States went to World War I, that would change dramatically. He said, now that I want to make sure that you understand this clearly, he said, now that we're going to war, all bets are off. And so we have a different story. There's something else to be known. So we can see that the role of industry was real key, but we could also look at the role of vehicles in the war. And here on this slide, we have two really kind of famous stories of the First World War. And one of them is about the taxis to the Marne. And this is a mythological story. I mean a mythological in the sense that it's a story that's told again and again by people that gives a meaning to the events that happened. And so the story is something like this. There was a big German offensive moving into the Marne. They were closing within 60 miles of Paris. You could actually hear heavy artillery pounding away from the outskirts of Paris. And there were no French forces at hand to get there. When the taxi drivers of Paris all got together and said, hey, let's go to the Eiffel Tower. And this picture on the left side is an actual photograph from that period of taxis. So every taxi driver available in Paris went to the Eiffel Tower, and they said, every soldier on leave in Paris, head for the Eiffel Tower, get there and hop in a cab, and we're going to shuttle you out. And so this was a story that's been told for 50 or 60 years after the war, that the taxi drivers, the working class, the blue-collar worker was the one who saved France, because they put all the soldiers in place to thwart the German offensive. And I hate to be the one who does the myth, but actually I kind of like to be the myth busting one. It turns out from historical analysis that myth is not true. That it's not true that they saved France, because in total there were about 3,000 cabs that were available. In total, it's believed that somewhere around 15,000 soldiers perhaps were shuttled in this trip up and down to the Marne. And actually there were 250,000 French troops that were moved there. They were moved by train, they were moved by bus, they were moved mostly by horse, and they were moved on foot. But it is a great myth that would come to shape the way people view World War I. And I promise if you Google this taxi to the Marne, you're still going to find a lot of historical sites that will tell you that the taxis. The picture on the right is also an important picture from the First World War. Lawrence of Arabia using Model Ts and Rolls-Royce Silver Ghosts, which have been converted to armored cars. And there's a lot of pictures of cars from World War I. But I want to make sure you understand that just because there's a lot of pictures doesn't mean that the cars were the dominant feature. That they weren't far from the dominant transport. In fact, one of the reasons there's so many pictures is they were actually an oddity. And so when people saw pictures of cars at war during the First World War, they took those pictures, and those pictures are preserved. And so there's there's a disproportionate number of pictures about vehicles in World War I than there were actually vehicles. At the same time, though, we don't want to underplay the significance, because the automobile industry was absolutely fundamental. There were a lot of vehicles. Model Ts were probably the most important vehicle in the war. Somewhere around 125,000 Ts found their way into the European theater, and they had a pretty substantial impact. But more importantly, the American automobile industry diversified. And here's another second imprint of the automobile, and I don't know if you consider these to be cars or not. I certainly don't consider them the cars, but these are the progeny. These are the offspring of the automobile. The caterpillar tread is generally attributed to a California vineyard where tractors were modified to move through the soft, sandy soil. That's one of the places, the origins of the caterpillar tread. And so it was adapted to these large vehicles. Some of you World War I buffs will have heard the story that the British team that was working on the first British tank, which it came to be known, was trying to do it in secrecy, and they had these very large panels and a lot of welding, and locals were asking what it was. And so they developed the cover story that they were building a large water tanks, new water tanks for ships. And water tanks on ships had been a perennial problem for a long time in the Navy. So they said that's water tanks we're working on. And so when they rolled it out, they said, here's our tank. And then that's where the name has come from. And I don't know the truth of that story, but that's one of the common attributions. But this is an automobile. Make no mistake, this is a consequence of Carl Benz activity. This is a consequence of developing drivetrains, of developing metallurgical techniques, developing manufacturing processes that were all driven by the automobile industry. And so there's a German Schneider on the left and a French Renault on the right. However, once again, this is a vehicle whose significance in the war has been dramatized by theater. It's been dramatized by photography, but actually they were so unreliable. They would run for a day or half a day or 2 days and then be broken down and be out for repairs. And they were used on the Western Front, on the Germans' Western Front, and that is in France. But their impact on the overall war was more symbolic probably than strategic. Still, everybody was ramping up and everybody was getting into the game. This is a 1915 Peugeot armored car. Peugeot produced about 65,000 trucks and cars, so we're starting to see some numbers. They produced 3,200 tanks, and then, of course, André Citroën invested heavily in aviation engines. Italy was also busy. This is a 1916 Fiat 2000. Fiat, located in Torino, produced about 50,000 trucks for the war. And they also diversified into munitions, aircraft engines, airframes. So you see the consistent story that it's the industry of the automobile that's making a very broader and more and a deeper impact on the conduct of the war. On the left, you see the AEC Type Y. This is Associated Equipment Company. They produced about 120,000 trucks, a substantial number. And if you look at those wheels real quick, you'll see those are hard rubber. That would have been a brutal ride. And of course, Rolls-Royce adopted its Silver Ghost very quickly to function as an armored car. Rolls-Royce also produced aircraft engines, and manufacturers such as Austin were making shells and caissons and other material. And so it's probably safe to say that the automobile industry had a more profound impact on the war than the automobile in combat. Now, the automobile was broadly used for logistics. It had a huge impact on logistics in Europe, and it also had a huge impact on logistics here in the United States in order to get those materials over to Europe. And so they had a pretty profound impact. If we take a closer look at American industry provided roughly 238,000 trucks. These are all estimates that are generated by historians trying to work their way through the data, but also then it was the ancillaries, Dodge and GM making munitions. Packard, of course, designed the Liberty aircraft engine, which would have a profound impact on aviation history, an absolutely amazing, robust, powerful, and reliable motor, and they were produced by a number of manufacturers. However, if we start looking past those major powers, if we start looking around the world and we start asking about, well, Russia, Russia had millions of soldiers in the war, or the Ottomans, or the Germans, or the Austro-Hungarians. This is their story. Very few. The number one source of cars for Germany and trucks was captured from the Allies. Austria-Hungary, almost none. Russia, almost none. The horse, if you want to weigh out what was the vehicle that really, really changed the terrain of the First World War, you look at the horse. In fact, the current estimates are roughly 8 million horses died. Perhaps a quarter of them in combat, and then 3/4 of them either from disease, famine, were worked to death and dying on the road as they were working with them. Soldiers fell in love with the cars just as much as soldiers fell in love with cars. Fell in love with the horses just as they fell in love with cars. And so this is a tribute photo taken shortly after the war where American soldiers were trying to pay homage to their fallen comrades, the horses that they had tended. And so it was a pretty profound significant impact from the horse. Now, what can we draw from all this? And one of the things we can do is we can look at the impact. And so there's some important things if you're going to talk about the war, the first thing you have to talk about is how horrific it was. This was way beyond the Civil War. This is way beyond any war that anybody had known for generation upon generation. This is kind of Black Death, bubonic plague scale of destruction. 65 million people were mobilized. And a rough estimate is that 1 out of 12 males in the United States were mobilized for this war, where they left home and got onto ships and headed off across the Atlantic. There were 10 million military deaths, and there were 10 million civilian deaths. And this is really significant because this is World War I is one of the ways the page is turned on history. From this point forward, there would be more civilian deaths than military deaths. And if you look at current wars in the Gulf War, and if you look at, for example, in Afghanistan, or if you look at Syria and Iraq, the new ratio is 10-1. For every one military combatant that dies, there's 10 civilians that dies because of the industrialization and because the ways wars are fought now. And World War I would be that turning point. One of the consequences of the war would be the modernization of industry, that new processes were developed. There was new innovation, the Liberty engine, for example, and technologies in material science that would make that possible, that they would reinvigorate car manufacturing. Because there were so many workers gone and so much demand for production, there was a new invigoration of complicated machine tools in the United States, that would rely even increasingly more on unskilled labor. And then there was new tooling and technology. And because when the war production ended, when there were no more submarines hunters to manufacture, and there were no more mines to manufacture, caissons, and it was time to retool. And so there was a new set of toolings and manufacturing process. We can look at the trucking industry in the United States. Because of this massive truck production, and because of the need to transport material to the East Coast, the whole infrastructure of the East Coast was developed. New roads, better roads with new signage and more gas stations and more amenities to get material. Things were manufactured across the United States, put on rail, sent to the railheads in the East Coast, and then loaded the ships. But you needed trucks, and you needed roads to make that happen. It also increased a whole new generation of automobile savvy people. And there had been a phenomenal, compared to every country in the world, there was a phenomenal number of Americans who were engaged in the automobile. But these military soldiers who had been assigned to the automobile, who now worked as mechanics, not because they loved the automobile, but because they were assigned to do it, further caused the ranks of mechanics and drivers to burgeon. And then finally, because there were such a high truck production. Now, most of the trucks were not brought back from Europe. There was not a large influx of surplus trucks because it was far more efficient just to dump them in Europe and leave them behind. And because so many of them were just utterly shattered and destroyed. We can talk about 125,000 Ts in Europe, but at any one time, there was only the smallest fraction of those available. And one of the reasons the T was disproportionately influential is because it had so many interchangeable parts. People could constantly cannibalize them. But this automobile in World War I would be the harbinger. It would be the crystal ball that would foretell the future of warfare, because everyone saw with the tanks the potential of what a tank might be. And it was the tank commanders, Patton and Rommel, who studied World War I, who came up with the battle strategies of the Second World War and the mechanization of soldiers, and more importantly, the role of industry in war in the future. In many ways, that was the last unmechanized war, because the fraction of mechanization was so low. And in many ways, it's the end of the civilian, because henceforward, you would require large number of civilians engaged in industrial processes to conduct the war. And so everybody, if you're working on a factory, you're now part of the war effort. And so the strategic bombing of the Second World War was a consequence of how the automobile industry created industrialized warfare. And so these are just, and once again, in this series, we're trying to hit some main kind of deep concepts that we think structure the way we think about these. And so at this point, I do want to bring Casey in. Casey, I know you've been thinking about this a long time, and I have a really pointed question ready for you. But I know that you have some things to say first, and so let me just go back and turn it over to you, Casey.
I mean, feel free to shoot some questions my way. You know, there's so much to unpack here about how the automobile both shaped World War I and how World War I shaped the automobile, because at this time, it was really a transformational period in American history, well, global history, where the automobile kind of became more than just a toy, a hobby. It really started to absolutely shape and transform our nation as well as the world. And it coincides really nicely, if you can say that, with World War I. I mean, World War I started with an automobile, right? Franz Ferdinand was assassinated as he gets into an automobile.
Absolutely.
Or in the automobile. And, you have these kind of greats, the Henry Ford coming about right at this period with the assembly line absolutely transforming society in America. Durant, these massive capitalists that had never really been seen before. And part of this story of them being pacifists, I think, also is the story of, the great capitalists that, kind of the number one rule of business is you don't bomb your potential customers, right?
Yeah.
Ford had assembly plants all over Europe. I mean, that he was a globalization king as far as production was concerned.
I just want to make a quick comment that this is time. Please start sending in your questions and comments for Casey and I, because we want to get those in just a second. I want to follow up with Casey a little bit, though. But I think you're right about something. I think that's a great observation that certainly at the turn of the century, the automobile was just a rich person's toy. It was something that would show up as circuses. Whenever the circuses came to town, they had a car with them. And that's how you saw a car for most people. And by the teens, it was obvious that there was racers and there was fame, but still it was primarily wealthy people. In 1914, now it's deathly business. When the automobile goes to war, all of a sudden it has an entirely different meaning. And that never really occurred to me before.
And what's also really interesting about that is, we often think of the military as kind of leading the curve as far as technology. They're ahead of the curve. They're helping to develop it. But at this time, as you said, I mean, the American people were shattered by war. They were generally pacifist, generally isolationist, and the American military was a very, very small component of the federal budget. And they did not do much development as far as the automobile was concerned. I mean, the first kind of armored vehicles were created by a rogue soldier, Davidson, when he put a machine gun on a Duryea. You know, I like to say, you know, people say when the second automobile was created, you had the first races. Well, the machine gun was developed right about the time the automobile was developed. And basically, as soon as you had an automobile, people started putting machine guns on them. You know, it's kind of followed. But the American military, there was a hierarchy for the cavalry, and the cavalry loved their horses, and the automobile was thought of as kind of this odd thing. You know, they didn't want to adopt it. While by the teens it was more reliable, it was still kind of cantankerous. It took special skill, whereas most of the members of the military knew how to, you know, operate a horse, for instance. It wasn't really until Pershing went down to the Mexican border to chase Pancho Villa around unsuccessfully that he said, look, we really need some automobiles down here. And that's when the military started to first really look at the car. And they had some tests and were fairly caught off guard when they entered World War I. And I mean, there were over 200 different makes of automobiles utilized. And I've seen figures as many as 50% of the cars and trucks that were in World War I were not actually operable at any one time.
That's right. Yeah. They were so fragile and so prone to
fragile,
breakage.
but also they couldn't find parts. I mean, standardization was a fundamental component of military life, but because there wasn't enough time for the military to fully develop a standardized vehicle between their chasing Pancho Villa and entering World War I, they just bought whatever they could. You know, there's a number of quotes following the war because there were congressional investigations on the demobilization as well as the mobilization of the war efforts, and people, you know, the secretaries of war and everybody interviewed basically said we had no intention of getting automobiles into the war. We thought, or into the military, we thought it would be a gradual process, and all of a sudden they were forced to pick all these cars. So they bought, you know, Whites were used, Model Ts, Packards, Cadillacs, Nash. I mean, you name it, everything and anything was used. Pierce was used. Pershing loved locomobiles. Dodges were used.
Yeah. Well, there's a huge body of literature that goes back centuries about military being resistant to technological innovation because they know that if somebody's going to have a bright idea that they're going to force on them and they get on the battlefield and it's not going to work. They don't want to be the testing ground for other people's bright ideas. And that's a really deep legacy in the military. So it's actually pretty astounding how quickly the automobile moved into World War I. It's very counterintuitive, but it wasn't an era of great change with gas and machine guns and all kinds of, yeah. And you know, in trench warfare, a car is basically useless. You know, it has almost no military utility, and that's the way the cavalry went. I do have one question. I know Amanda's going to get a question to us real quick, but one question I have is that now your current field of specialty is one of the things you do is working on figuring out which cars in particular you can look at and say, this is a significant car because of the historical story, be the way it contributes to our society because of its background. And in the context of the First World War, how would you look at what criteria would you use to say, you know, this is a vehicle that we really ought to preserve and look at that car because X, Y, and Z. What's X, Y, and Z on that, Casey?
So we've actually identified one, and this is part of why I've done quite a bit of research on this topic, because there is a 1918 Cadillac that still exists that was used in Europe during the war. It's probably the only car that's preserved that was actually used by the US military in France during the war, because as you mentioned, most of the vehicles that were used by the US were either disposed of or sold off as salvage. And the military kept actually incredible records of this. They auctioned absolutely everything off, but this one Cadillac survives because the patriotism of those that did participate in the war. The car was actually purchased by a civilian that felt the war effort was so important. He bought his own car and shipped it to France with the YMCA, helped set up leave areas for soldiers as a civilian. And then, you know, obviously fairly wealthy after the war, because it was a personally owned vehicle, he was able to ship it back, and that car survives to this day. Yeah. And so we picked that car and did a lot of research on it because it represents a lot of these ideas. You know, it represents the idea that America didn't have a Jeep. so to speak. We just kind of picked whatever cars existed, because actually the Cadillac was one of the more common cars used by officers. About 2,000 vehicles went over from Cadillac, as well as Cadillac produced tank engines and airplane engines.
So the narrative, what I'm hearing you say is that one way people look at a car and they say this car is significant because it was the first one with 6-wheel drive, or pick X, whatever technological. But the reason you're choosing this one is because you think it represents a set of values and dispositions that are a hallmark of that period of the American experience.
Yeah, it speaks a lot to that, and it
Yeah.
tells us something about what happened with the automobile in World War One.
Yeah, that's amazing. How we doing, Amanda? Do you have something for us? Anything we can help with?
I do. I actually have lots of questions coming in. This group is always fantastic about asking a lot of questions. So shall we just jump in with some of these?
Yeah.
The 20th century success of the automobile is attributed to the freedom to travel. Was that given a jump start by the tens of thousands of young men returning from Europe with new skills, experience with travel, and a love for the automobile? I think you may have touched on that a little earlier.
Casey, you first. I got a lot to say on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly think so. You know, an interesting tidbit about that Cadillac I discussed, the gentleman that took it to war, after the war was over, he actually toured around France with it because he enjoyed so much his work with the YMCA. And then when he gets back to America, when he ships the car back, he tours around the national parks with that Cadillac. So I think that's kind of a direct example of that sort of freedom that he experienced for travel with an automobile.
Yeah. And I would add that the national parks system was well underway, and it had been established prior to the war precisely because of the urge to travel. And so the automobile is often attributed as the source of the national park system. So this deep desire to go out and explore and be curious and find the world is one of the fundamental engines that drives the automobile. However, at the same time, to really appreciate the whole automobile, you have to go and add all the other things onto it. It's an outlet for creativity. It's for technical challenges of people who want to tinker or invent. It's an outlet for people who have a commercial energy and they want to thrive and mix it up in the business world. It's a place for teenagers to get out there and tear up the world and, you know, drink hard and party hard and have fun and live life on the edge. And so the automobile has all those attributes. But the internationalization of the young American man off in the world to see Europe excited a real passion for travel in the United States.
We have another question from Paul. How much innovation happened in the war zone as soldiers and maintenance crews had to salvage damaged equipment to create new vehicles? So do you know of things that came out of that process?
I know that the war was an improvised war in the trenches. And I know that especially when it came to hand-to-hand weapons, there is massive archives of different brass knuckles and knives and trench tools that were used. And I know very little about the specific innovations, the addition of extra armor, the adapting machine guns and weapons to the cars. And I think one of the reasons might be is the biggest picture of the car was not combat. The overwhelming use of the car was logistics. It was for ambulances, because ambulances were a very special niche where you had to have really fast response. And so there were disproportionately ambulances, trucks for transport. And then I believe there were 8,000 passenger automobiles used in the European theater, the American manufacturer. And they went almost exclusively to officers who, as a rule, don't go near bullets. Yeah. So I don't know the answer to that. I know you can guarantee though that everybody pimps the ride. Anybody who gets in a car, you know, starts with hanging fuzzy dice from it or something. So I guarantee it happened, but I don't know what the story is.
Okay. Can you speak to the connection of the development of cars during World War I and the development of airplanes and air warfare?
Yeah. Well, the early aviation motors that were most successful were rotary motors because they were so much lighter. But they had all kinds of problems with torque and cooling, and it made the planes hard to perform. And so I mentioned earlier about the Liberty engine as an American innovation, and that became a very significant engine. But there were other inline motors developed by SPAD, for example, using Hispano-Suiza engines, I believe, and then also German developed engines used in the Albatross. And so these came later in the war, and eventually the inline automotive style motors would supersede the rotaries. And I think the thing that makes them successful, though, is the story behind them of material science, increasing engineering and materials, hardened materials, and increasing precision machine tooling. Because all the theoretical pieces had been in place prior to the war for these new aviation motors. And so they would also have a legacy in the automotive industry after the war, because Packard Motors, of course, would acquire an absolutely legendary status following the First World War. As far as another way we can trace the impact between aviation and the automobile industry is by looking at the drivers, because it turns out that closing at 100 miles an hour with an object that's stationary or moving at an angle away from you at 100 miles an hour, 150 miles an hour is a very peculiar set of skills that was held by American race car drivers. And of course, the American top ace was Eddie Rickenbacker. And there were two things that he said made him successful. One was the fact that he knew how to judge speed and closing and velocity. And the second was he knew how not to tear apart his machine. Because the pilots in the European theater who had no grounding in the mechanical side of it, they would climb in the plane, push the throttle all the way forward, and then run it until it blew itself up. And so the engines had to be rebuilt on a nearly daily basis. But Rickenbacker knew how to nurse the power of his airplane, and so he could get top performance of it. And that was one of the, so you can draw lines certainly between automobile racing, and there were other famous racers who flew.
Okay, next question. Casey, did you want to say anything to that, or?
No, I mean, again, to Ken's point earlier in the presentation about, the amount of impact of the automotive industry as far as the manufacturing was immense,
Yeah.
and so much went into manufacturing these airplanes, the airplane engines from the automobile manufacturers. The impact would be massive.
Yeah, and I would also, one more thing is the planes were extremely expensive to run. They took a lot of maintenance, and they took a lot of material, and they demanded a huge logistics supply train behind them. And so without the automobile the Army Air Corps, would have been impossible. It wouldn't have been, without the automobile to support it.
Is it viewed by historians that the nexus for the military-industrial complex concept was born during World War I?
I've heard it cited as early as the Civil War. Rockefeller was, for example, who started U.S. Standard Oil of America, got his beginning as a supplier inside for war material in the North. And furthermore, people have probably heard the term lobbyist before. The term lobbyist referred to military contractors who would sit in the lobby outside the House of Representatives during the Civil War and wait for members of Congress to come out to try and contact them about selling them war material. And so in the American context, the first kind of, and the term, I can tell you a really interesting term that did emerge from the First World War was the term daddy war bucks. The idea of massive, large-scale war profiteering was clearly associated with the First World War, but there's a lot of evidence that didn't happen. It definitely didn't happen for Ford. I think Ford's net revenue, I actually have that in my notes here. Ford, he was opposed to the war. He did not want to be associated with profiteering. And so Ford's total profit from the war effort was $4 million. That's the total profit he made on all the contracts during the war, was $4,357,000, which barely covered his retooling costs. So certainly the myth of the military industrial complex where these arms manufacturers start to play an increasing role in policy making happens then. I'm sorry, I got more to say on that. This is such an interesting topic, but actually it predates that, because the first time generals become really large-scale decision makers in economic policy happens when the dreadnought movement begins around 1903, when the massive steel and iron ships, which require huge capital investment, and then military decision makers have to be part of the civilian budgetary process. And during the First World War, for the United States, you have to remember, of course, the United States was going from zero to full speed. There was no such thing as a standing army. You had a very small officer corps. You had ships that were laying around, but then you ramped it all up. And after the Second World War, the United States built down a little, but never after the Second World War. Since the Second World War, it's been full-time, large-scale military deployment 24/7. I don't know, what do we have now, 3 million? I don't know how many soldiers in arms. It's certainly less than 3 million, but it's over 1 million soldiers right now in uniform, living their lives. And that would have been an impossibility in the World War I period. People would have not understood that and wouldn't have supported it.
Yeah, that I think Ken makes a really good point about that. You know, before World War I and even after World War I, leading up to World War II, there were a number of attempts to remobilize. You know, many in the military understood that there was still conflict in Europe. There was still a good chance that we'd be in another major war, and tried desperately to get more soldiers as well as more technology. And I have a great quote here. The officers of the planning branch found it inconceivable in the light of American practice and thinking that the United States would ever begin mobilizing before the outbreak of the war. So certainly between World War I and World War II, the industrial military complex was minor. The U.S. military had maybe 30 tanks in 1933, whereas, you know, there were thousands and thousands being built in Europe.
Yeah, it was a term, of course, that was coined by President Eisenhower. It was the first one known to use the term military and industrial complex, and he was speaking specifically about the early 1950s and the post-World War II experience.
So I have a couple of questions that are directly for Casey. And so Ken, may I give you an assignment while Casey answers these questions?
This doesn't involve push-ups, does it?
No,
Okay.
not this time. Would you, you could scroll through the Q&A and see if there's anything there that particularly jumps out that you want to cover, but I do have a couple of questions that have been asked directly of Casey. So one is, did you take any courses from Ken when you were a student? If so, what were they and how did they impact your career?
Oh my goodness. I think I took every course Ken had to offer. I don't know. I probably had 2 classes every semester with him, everything from international relations, American diplomacy, technology and society. I'm sure I'm missing a lot. And Ken was also my senior advisor. So yeah, I think about the many concepts we discussed in lectures with Ken's famous snooze box.
Tell us about that.
Oh, the projector, the overhead projector. He always called it the snooze box.
Yeah.
So maybe you could just share a little bit then about how your coursework at the college, you took photography classes as well, in addition to the auto restoration and the history, all of those. How your experience here then led into the work you're doing now.
So, you know, it gave me such a well-rounded look at how the automobile is part of our society, but also how the classic car industry has many different opportunities, you know. So the automobile, why it matters to people is its history, its impact and culture, and how people, the story of people shape why we love that so much, you know, and how it's a cultural entity that needs to be studied. And I found out about the Historic Vehicle Association early in my time at McPherson, and it was right up my alley. I was very interested in how to make sure the automobile became kind of a long-lasting legacy, even as we transitioned to autonomous cars. And I really wanted to figure out okay, I wanted to do something to save that story of the car. And I found out about the field of historic preservation and the work that was done for the National Register of Historic Places to save the stories of all these great buildings that may not exist 50, 100 years from now. And how do we save that? And kind of the well-rounded education I got at McPherson, looking at, okay, photography, because that became a major part of my work, because to document a vehicle, to save its story, involves photographing it. My work with Ken, as far as history and culture, how to document those aspects of what makes a vehicle significant.
So would you tie that in then to the 1918 Cadillac that you referred to? I've seen that vehicle. It's fascinating. Could you talk a little bit, I know you could talk a long time about it.
Oh, yeah.
Could you share a little bit about the decisions that were made in restoring that vehicle?
Yeah, so obviously that's
Restoring,
why,
preserving.
yeah. So obviously that ties into the fact that, look, I learned a little bit more about history. I also learned about actually working on a car and what makes a car significant in itself, technologically, mechanically. And that car, that 1918 Cadillac, what's especially neat about it is it was never fully restored. So as far as a historian is concerned, this is just like the greatest thing ever, because it hasn't been shaped by other people's decisions about what is significant about that vehicle. It has been maintained, it was repainted, but as a kind of archaeologist, we can look at that car and kind of peel back the layers, and it still has some dirt on it. So is that dirt from its time in France when it was on the front lines of World War I? Should we save that dirt, or does that dirt affect the vehicle? Should we get that vehicle running? Because that car was not running at the time. And so we actually, with the HVA, we've had a number of conferences where we discuss topics like this. Is an unrestored car meant to be running? What sort of damage will it do to the fabric of the vehicle if we decide to get that vehicle running? And ultimately, it's privately owned, and the owner decided to get it running, which is really neat, and can tell us something about what it was like to have seen it operated in period.
Great, thank you for that. Because there's a bullet hole that still exists.
Oh yeah, it has a bullet hole. I mean, the original paint is under it. So something that's really interesting that a lot of people don't understand is the olive drab green we all think we know and love, that is, in World War II Jeeps. That olive drab was completely different in World War I. It was more of a tan color. And this car is actually repainted in the 30s for a movie with olive drab green. But underneath that olive drab is that tan color. And then underneath that is the original blue paint, dark blue paint. Interesting.
I encourage everybody to look that up on the vehicle register. All of those cars are really interesting to read about. We have a question here. I don't know, Ken, do you have one you want to?
There's one here from Mary Kay. Congratulations on your promotions. Is that the one you were going to point to, Amanda?
That was one of them. I've got on my list.
Yeah, it's a really great question. It's about the future of the autonomous vehicle, and how does that impact the future of warfare? And I think the question of the autonomous vehicle is in many ways far more up to grabs than people appreciate. That's to say, in 1900, all the smart money was on steam and electrics. In 1890, the gasoline engine was a long shot, and the electric car didn't come into its own for 100 years because of advances in battery technology. And right now, while they're sorting out the particularities, there's obstacles to getting the autonomous vehicle to where it ought to be. And we can think that the future of them is in the near term, that they're going to be solved, but it may take another generation of computer speed and processing and information, and you don't know. So no one knows what that future is and how close and far it is. However, how that impacts the battlefield is profound if it achieves that AI qualities that the developers are working for, and the person who writes that question can imagine these possible consequences. But we can look at, what you might look as a close similarity is having the remotely piloted aircraft was something, I think it began with wired systems in German flight bombs in 1930s, late 1930s, where they had long wires, miles long, that they attached to missiles that they shot at ships. But that changed everything about that technology. And now the capacity of drones changes everything about battlefield intelligence, as well as weapons delivery, the war on terror. And so it has a profound, and the possibility, I think Bill Gates identifies that as the thing that keeps him awake at night, the idea that um, intelligent autonomous weapons evolve, and that so the evolution of the autonomous smart vehicle is certainly a double-edged sword, because remember, they're a lot faster, and they process information faster than any human can, and so it is one of those kind of nightmare scenarios in some ways. But the autonomous vehicle on a battlefield, imagine if you never got lost. I mean, one of the big stories of that map in France is everybody was lost all the time, and the road signs get blown over if you could read them, and people change them. And imagine not, I mean, GPS has changed that dramatically, but still a driver that never gets lost, that knows exactly when they're going to arrive. The consequences of coordinating, of getting all vehicles into a place for coordinated maneuvers. There's just, it just goes on and on and on.
So we have another question here. So I always feel like I'm cutting
Sorry.
you off because I know you could talk long.
I gotta say again.
I want to get through some more of these. And I will say that I know some people are going to have to leave right now because we're right at about an hour. We still have several questions I'd like to try to get through in a few minutes if we can. World War I marked the beginning of the motorized ambulance corps, which used primarily Ivy League students to drive their vehicles. These drivers were actually trained in Allentown, Pennsylvania, which is where Casey works, prior to shipping overseas, where they were attached to the French Army.
Yeah.
Have you studied the change in mechanizing emergency vehicles as a result of World War I?
I have not. I mean, other than understanding that they were used, that was one of the primary uses, especially the Model T, because early on, before America pledged its involvement in World War I, the British were trying to purchase a lot of vehicles, as well as some of the other countries, and Ford said, look, we'll sell you them, but they can't be used in any sort of combat. So a lot of the early Ford Model Ts that went over were in fact ambulances. The same was true with the Dodge cars that went over.
If I were going to study it, and I haven't, if I were going to study it, here's how I'd do it. I'd look at the MASH helicopters of the Korean War as an analogy. And I'd try to figure out exactly, because we have the same situation where we have a limited set of vehicles that solve a very particular need for urgency and transit and smoothness. And all of a sudden you have this new mix of technology. And I'd look at the pilots, the people who got recruited in them, how they interacted, how they affected mortality rates on the battlefield. And if I were going to do that study, I'd use that. But I'd also point out that that large core of ambulances and ambulance drivers also had an impact on gender in the United States, because so many men were abroad and they were used in the factories, that women became, of course, integrated in the factory system. But a lot of the transport drivers that shuttled the vehicles from production to the port were women. And so there was a large number of women that were trained to drive ambulances in the United States and put them behind the wheel.
Casey, we have greetings from Krieger Smith from the
Yes.
Auto and Truck Museum in Auburn, Indiana. He's asking about the HVA getting closer to a process for submission of National Historic Vehicle Register applications from the public or from historical organizations or museums.
We're getting closer. Every year, we're getting closer. Still a process.
It was quite a process to get to the point you're at now.
Oh, yeah.
Many years, and a lot of work. Our friend,
I'm going to follow up on that. Did you have any idea of what you were getting into? I mean, the HVA's expanded, and all of a sudden the scope of vehicles to consider and all the significance tied up in it. Did you have any idea where they're headed?
Not really, no. It has been quite a trip.
Okay, good.
Um, now I'm going to say his name wrong because I pronounced it right the first time, but Abhinav has asked, it's a question that diverges a little, but he said, or maybe fast forwarding a wee bit, was the Rolls-Royce V12 that was designed in about 1936 or 37 used as the base for the design of the airplane engine for World War II and completely adapted only for airplanes thereafter? Wasn't the V12 it was Cadillacs had them through the 30s, right?
It was
What about
actually, it was developed for the Thompson Cup seaplane racers, because there was fierce competition among European powers to race seaplanes, and the Rolls-Royce Merlin was the engine that completely shattered the record in the 1930s. Now, there was always a knowledge of it that it could be used for military applications, but the design and development of it was purely civilian, and it was not a military project. That would become the definitive supermotor of the Spitfire, and then eventually in the post-war racing period, and one of the most significant motors ever developed. But it's because of the extraordinary precision and balance inside of that motor. Yeah. Did that answer the question? So originally it was a completely civilian project, and it was an obsessive, absolutely obsessive motor engineer. Just brilliant. It's a great story. Yeah.
Okay, let's see. Here's a comment. Ken is correct that the MASH hospitals in Korea really started what we know as emergency medical treatment. The Vietnam War led to what we now know as EMS.
Yeah.
Did any automotive brands get a civilian consumer boost directly as a result of their World War I participation?
So one that I really point to is actually the development of four-wheel drive vehicles kind of came about from World War I, and especially chasing Pancho Villa along the Mexican border. There was a company that kind of developed the most successful four-wheel drive vehicle, the four-wheel drive company out of Wisconsin, which was a very small entity, but by the end of World War I, they became the preeminent manufacturer of four-wheel drive vehicles and had about 15,000 of their vehicles used in the war in Europe. There were contracts for about 30,000, but another important fact about the war is we didn't know how long we'd be there, and we were actually there for a fairly short amount of time. And when on Armistice Day, I mean, there were probably twice as many contracts outstanding for vehicles that were sitting in boats waiting to go over to Europe that were just canceled.
About this question, one thing is we know for sure from the Second World War that soldiers fell in love with the Jeep. And so it had a profound impact on post-war production. But I think that because the automobile was not really tied to the combat experience, it was more about logistics, and it was about ferrying officers around. I don't think people came away from World War I with a feeling that there was a patriotic company that had won the war. You know, in World War II, there was one of the questions that appeared on the side was also about the arsenal of democracy and the role of Ford. General Motors was the overwhelming supplier of military supplies in the Second World, far more than Ford. And so Ford didn't really get much identity boost, but there were companies around the world that took a real hit. For instance, Renault collaborated with the French in Vichy, France, and so for decades, many French were resistant to buying Renaults. They call them collabis, collaboration cars. And so there is military and national identity tied to the car, definitely, but I don't know of that in the First World War.
We have another question about the amphibian and when it was invented and its role in wars.
Well, I was going to say that's interesting because the Schneider was that armored vehicle that I showed in that earlier in that slide was a moderately amphibious. It was meant to cross shallow water, but it didn't float. And so to my knowledge, the amphibian doesn't emerge in combat until the Second World War. And the first way it emerged was with inflatable bladders that were placed around vehicles that could suspend them for periods of time, track vehicles, and then would become amphibious. But then docks and other specialized landing equipment, and of course the German Schwimmenwagen was a late 1930s development, which was a Volkswagen.
One of the early questions I haven't gotten in yet was, would you discuss what it was like to obtain fuel for the motor vehicles? Was it difficult during World War I, and did it limit the usage of the vehicles?
Yeah. World War I was a petroleum war. It was an important part of military thinking, but the octane demands were so low. I don't know what was the octane in usage. I know in 1940s, aviation fuel, avgas, was 87 octane. And so the octane needs, I mean, T's had originally been designed so that they could run off of vegetable oil. And so at least that's the story that is often told about them. And so the octane demands were very, very low. You could probably put just about anything in many of those cars. Maybe not kerosene, but pretty close.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with any direct anecdotes around that. I mean, the primary stories and figures that I've read that held back the use of the vehicle was more to do with the fact that they just weren't that reliable, and then when they broke or there wasn't the technical expertise, they just couldn't obtain parts. There's a figure that there were, for one of Pershing's divisions, it required about 3,500 horsepower, versus in World War II, the typical Army division would have required 400,000 mechanical horsepower.
Wow.
So an increase of about 228 times. I mean, the automobile was still very limited in its use.
Yeah. And I would add to that there's a lot of examples from the Second World War where you can look at the tactical structure, how the Battle of the Bulge was fought, for example, where it's all about logistics and fuel. And I don't know of any examples of that from the First World War.
Do either of you have any closing comments you'd like to share with our audience before we wrap things up?
I have one, and then I'm going to let you go, okay? Can we do that, Casey?
Sure.
You can say no. Get out of my way. I'm going to talk. Good. Okay. So one of the things that's coming together, and I've been rethinking the automobile in many ways. This has been a real challenge for me to do this material. It's stuff I've thought about for a lot of years, but bringing it together in a coherent way and understanding this kind of format has really developed my thinking. And the more I think about the automobile, I think what we need to understand is that all technology is something that increases our capacities. The automobile has this unique versatility where technology is fundamentally different from the person who designed it. Like the person who designed cell phones, they didn't think that you'd all be texting instead of calling. The text was a side idea, but now the cell phones completely transformed from its original role. The automobile was just such a versatile concept of empowering people that it had these things where it has a military capacity, but it also has this massive creative capacity. It has a capacity to let you explore the world and engage it. It has a place as a format for romance. It's a place to go fast and get passion. It's a place for engaging in your artistic capacities. And so because the automobile is such a real plug and play technology, it fits really well into the human spirit in all the varieties and complexities of the human spirit. So I didn't know what the answer to the question was going to be in each of these episodes. I knew that they were really great questions to ask, and I knew that there was going to be an answer because I know that the complexity of the human being finds it manifested in the complexity of the automobile. And so when you think about World War I, you think about it's not people who just want to go out there and defeat tactical objectives. It's people who want to survive the process. It's people who want to eat. It's people who want to have fun. It's people who want to go on leave. And it's all these diverse goals of soldiers and civilians and leaders and victims and people that wraps itself up into the story of the automobile.
Yeah, I would echo a lot of those great things, but really to underscore that idea that there was no prescribed format for how the automobile was used or affected both World War I and society afterwards, because it was just kind of willy-nilly picked up. We'll get this car or this car, and so it had so many different but profound effects.
Yeah, very ad hoc. Great.
Thank you both for your time today. Thanks to everybody who's joined us. Next week, we only have one left of our Wheels of Change series. It's gone very quickly, for me at least. And I want to encourage you to share with your friends, have them look up McPherson College Wheels of Change and sign up for next week. We'll close out our webinars with Art for the People, how Harley Earl and automotive styling democratized beauty. We'll have our good friend Donald Osborne as our guest, and his bio is a little too long for me to cover in a brief plug, but many of you will know him. It's going to be fun. It's going to be informative. There will be laughter. There could even be some singing. Who knows when Donald's around. And so
I hope so. Amazing voice.
Yes, yes. And so please sign up if you haven't for next week. We send the email out to all of the registrants so that you can participate. Join us for our final Wheels of Change next week on Thursday. Thank you all and have a great day.
Thank you, Casey. Thank you,
guys so
Amanda.
much.
Thanks, everybody.